He thought he was serving just another customer. He thought he could mock him, delay him, dismiss him. But when Big Shaq drops the truth, the entire restaurant goes dead silent. Because tonight, the rules are about to change. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The Windsor Royale was not just a restaurant. It was a symbol of status, wealth, and power. A place where the city's elite gathered to sip on aged wine, discuss investments, and indulge in the finest dishes prepared by world-renowned chefs. The air inside was thick with exclusivity. Soft jazz played in the background, blending with the delicate clinking of crystal glasses and hushed conversations. Men in tailored suits sat back in plush leather chairs, their laughter smooth and controlled. Women in designer dresses flicked through their menus with a practiced elegance, their diamond-studded fingers tapping lightly against the pages. Everything about the Windsor exuded perfection, sophistication, and most importantly, control. And then, the doors opened. The moment Big Shaq stepped inside, the energy in the room shifted. He didn't storm in. He didn't demand attention. Yet, he commanded it effortlessly. Tall, broad-shouldered, with an aura of quiet dominance, Shaq carried himself with a confidence that required no introduction. His dark tailored suit fit perfectly, the crisp white of his shirt contrasting against his deep brown skin. A luxury timepiece, gold, understated but expensive, gleamed subtly against his wrist, catching the warm glow of the chandeliers above. He didn't look around nervously like someone stepping into a world they didn't belong in. He moved with the ease of a man who knew his worth, knew his power, and knew he had every right to be there. Yet, despite his composure, the room noticed. Eyes flicked up from menus. Conversations slowed. Some guests glanced at him with curiosity. Who is he? Others with thinly veiled judgment. He doesn't look like he belongs. At the entrance podium, Nathan Caldwell had already spotted him. Nathan had been the head waiter of the Windsor for over 15 years. In his mind, his job was more than serving food. It was guarding the restaurant's exclusivity. He could instantly recognize who belonged here and who didn't. It wasn't about the money. Some men walked in with wealth, but still lacked the refinement to fit in. And from the moment he laid eyes on Shaq, Nathan had already made his decision. This man did not belong. Nathan straightened his posture, smoothing out his pristine white cuffs before stepping forward. His smile was practiced, polished, but not genuine. As Shaq moved toward the host stand, Nathan blocked his path. "Sir," Nathan began, his tone calm, professional, but laced with something unspoken. "We have a strict reservation policy." Shaq lifted an eyebrow. Nathan continued, his lips curling ever so slightly. "Perhaps a more casual place would suit you better?" The words hung in the air, thick with implication. The tension ignited. A few guests who had been watching exchanged quiet glances, some amused, others uncomfortable. Shaq didn't react right away. He let the moment breathe. Then, he inhaled slowly, tilting his head just slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Nathan's. He had been in situations like this before. The subtle insults, the polite dismissals, the unspoken message that no matter how successful he was, there would always be someone trying to remind him of a place they thought he should stay in. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth, steady, and filled with something that made Nathan hesitate, just for a second. "Oh?" Shaq said, his tone carrying the faintest trace of amusement. "And what place is that?" Nathan's posture stiffened, but his smile remained. "Sir," he repeated, this time with a little more weight, as if trying to regain control. "We're fully booked for the evening. Without a reservation, I'm afraid we can't accommodate walk-ins." Shaq slowly reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times before holding it up for Nathan to see. There, under the confirmed reservations list, was a name that made the color drain from Nathan's face. James Big Shaq Reynolds, VIP guest. The podium's reservation book had the same name written in bold, unmistakable letters. Nathan blinked. He had been so sure, so certain that this man was a mistake, an outsider who had wandered into the wrong place. And now? Now, he realized he had just tried to deny a VIP guest entry. A silence settled over the moment, growing heavier with each passing second. A couple seated near the entrance whispered amongst themselves, while a sharply dressed man at the bar swirled his whiskey, watching the exchange with interest. Nathan swallowed, forcing out another smile. But it no longer held the same confidence. "My apologies, Mr. Reynolds," he said quickly, clearing his throat. "Right this way." But Shaq didn't move. He stayed exactly where he was, watching Nathan with an expression that was impossible to read. And for the first time, Nathan felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Doubt. This wasn't over. Not even close. And as Shaq finally took a slow step forward, the weight of the moment shifted. The game had begun, and Nathan had already made his first mistake. Nathan Caldwell was not used to being wrong. For years, he had controlled the flow of the Windsor Royale, deciding who was worth a warm welcome and who deserved a polite dismissal. He had spent 15 years perfecting the art of exclusion, never outright hostile, never overtly rude, just subtle enough that those on the receiving end felt it but could never quite prove it. And yet, here he was, staring at the name in the reservation book, his throat tightening as reality settled in. James Big Shaq Reynolds, VIP guest. The words burned against the paper. Nathan had been so sure that Shaq didn't belong, that he had somehow stumbled into the wrong restaurant, the wrong world, the wrong class. But now? Now he realized his mistake had been made in full view of an audience that was paying attention. Still, admitting fault was not in his nature. So instead of apologizing, instead of acknowledging his error, Nathan adjusted. And Shaq? Shaq watched it happen. Nathan's smile returned, but this time it was tight, forced. The smile of a man scrambling to regain control. "My apologies for the confusion, Mr. Reynolds," he said smoothly, as if the last few minutes hadn't happened. He straightened his posture, trying to reclaim the authority he had just lost. "We'll have your table ready shortly." Shaq said nothing. Not because he didn't have a response, but because he knew silence was more powerful. Nathan turned sharply on his heel and walked away, but he didn't go to prepare a table. Instead, he made Shaq wait. And wait. A well-dressed couple entered the restaurant moments later. White, mid-40s, the kind of guests Nathan catered to without question. "Welcome, Mr. Sinclair." Nathan greeted them with a warmth that had been absent in his exchange with Shaq. "Your table is ready." Without hesitation, he led them past Shaq, guiding them toward a prime seating area near the grand windows. Shaq watched as Nathan personally pulled out their chairs, handed them their menus, and engaged in pleasant conversation. He noticed, and he wasn't the only one. Across the room, a young server hesitated near the bar, his eyes flicking between Shaq and Nathan, discomfort evident on his face. Near the far end of the dining area, a woman in a navy blue dress, poised and elegant, took a slow sip of her wine. Her gaze lingered on the scene unfolding before her, unreadable, assessing. Shaq exhaled through his nose, a quiet breath, steady and controlled. This wasn't new. He had seen this tactic before, punishment through delay, control through subtle humiliation. And Nathan? Nathan was about to give him a masterclass in it. When Nathan finally returned, he carried a menu tucked under his arm. He set it down in front of Shaq with deliberate ease, his fingers resting on the leather cover for a second too long before sliding it toward him. "There you are, sir," Nathan said, his tone neutral, but his eyes sharp. Shaq picked it up, flipping it open. And then he paused. Lunch menu. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message. Shaq glanced up, meeting Nathan's gaze. Nathan didn't flinch. Instead, he offered the slightest tilt of his head, the ghost of an expression dancing at the corner of his lips, a silent dare. "Say something. Call it out. Make a scene." Shaq exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the menu. He wouldn't give Nathan that satisfaction. Instead, he closed the menu and leaned back in his chair. Nathan's fingers twitched at his side. He had expected more. He had wanted a reaction. But Shaq simply said, "Dinner menu." Nathan's lips parted slightly, but Shaq's gaze didn't waver. The order wasn't a request. It was a statement. For the first time, Nathan was forced to comply. And when he walked away to retrieve the correct menu, His posture was a little less confident. 15 minutes passed. Shaq hadn't received a drink order. Every other table had. Waiters moved fluidly across the restaurant, delivering handcrafted cocktails, glasses of red and white, chilled sparkling water poured from crystal pitchers. Shaq's glass remained empty. And Nathan? Nathan made sure of it. Shaq caught the small exchanges, the subtle moments of interference. A young waiter, new, nervous, hesitant, had reached for the water pitcher earlier, eyes darting toward Shaq's table. Nathan had stopped him, a light touch to the shoulder, a low whisper, a slow shake of the head. The young waiter had hesitated, then placed the pitcher back down. Shaq leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the table, watching. Nathan was testing boundaries, checking to see just how much Shaq was willing to tolerate before he broke. Shaq tilted his head. Interesting. Finally, a waiter, not Nathan, but someone else, a man who had clearly caught on to the tension in the room, approached with a pitcher in hand. "Apologies for the wait, sir," he said, voice polite but slightly uneasy. He poured the water quickly before disappearing, not wanting to get caught between whatever was unfolding. Shaq lifted his glass, taking a slow sip. Nathan, standing near the bar, watched the entire thing. And for the first time that night, Shaq saw it, the slightest flicker of frustration in his expression. The first crack. When Shaq finally closed the menu, ready to order, Nathan appeared almost instantly. He had been waiting for this moment. Shaq glanced up at him. "I'll take the aged Wagyu," he said smoothly. "Medium rare." Nathan clicked his pen once, his grip tightening slightly on the notebook. Then he tilted his head ever so slightly. "Ah," he murmured, his tone shifting into something mock thoughtful. "That's one of our more premium selections." Shaq said nothing. Nathan let the moment hang, just long enough for nearby guests to hear. "I can bring out something similar," he continued, flipping a page in his notepad. "The ribeye is a great cut. Less expensive, of course, but still very flavorful." There it was, the unspoken suggestion, the assumption, the final push. Shaq inhaled slowly. And then, he smiled. Not a grin. Not amusement. Just a slow, controlled expression that made Nathan's fingers tighten around his pen. "I said," Shaq repeated, his voice calm but edged with something that made Nathan pause. "Aged Wagyu, medium rare." Nathan blinked. For the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. He had spent the entire night laying traps, pushing limits, waiting for the inevitable moment when Shaq would snap, lose his composure, become the problem. But now it was Nathan who felt trapped, and Shaq was just getting started. The tension in the Windsor Royale had evolved from a slow, simmering undercurrent into a charged, inescapable weight pressing down on the restaurant. The air was thick with it, pulsing between the clink of silverware, the occasional murmur of conversation, and the deliberate silence of those who had been watching, pretending not to, but unable to look away. Shaq remained composed, unshaken despite every subtle insult, every microaggression expertly placed to provoke him. He had endured it with the kind of restraint that only came with experience. This was not new. But Nathan Caldwell wasn't finished yet. And now, he was about to make his biggest mistake of the night. Shaq casually picked up his menu again, though he didn't need it. His decision was already made. He glanced up at the nearest waiter. Not Nathan, but another server standing a few feet away, waiting hesitantly for instruction. "The Margot," Shaq said, his voice smooth, measured. 2015. The young waiter blinked, hesitated. And then, before he could respond, Nathan laughed. Not a small chuckle, not a polite, controlled response. A full, open scoff, loud and unrestrained. Heads turned. The sound was sharp, slicing through the restaurant's usual low hum of conversation like a knife. Nathan shook his head, letting the moment drag before speaking, making sure the words landed exactly how he wanted them to. "That bottle costs more than most people's salaries," he said, his tone drenched in condescension. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile, more of a challenge, a test, a dare. "You sure you want to go with that?" The restaurant paused. A hush fell over the space, as if the entire room had inhaled at the same time and forgotten to exhale. Shaq didn't move. He didn't even blink. But he felt it. The shift. The shift in the way the guests at nearby tables tensed slightly, their forks motionless in midair. The shift in how some leaned forward, eager for a spectacle, while others exchanged quick glances, debating whether to intervene or remain silent. And then, of course, there were the ones who found it amusing. A man in a tuxedo at a table near the bar exhaled a quiet chuckle, glancing at his companion as if to say, "This should be interesting." A woman in a red dress, her wine glass raised halfway to her lips, let out a sharp breath that wasn't quite laughter but close enough. But not everyone was entertained. Across the room, the woman in the navy blue dress, the one who had been watching since the beginning, set her glass down slowly. Her expression didn't shift, but the movement itself said enough. She wasn't watching for entertainment. She was waiting. Shaq exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, out of calculation. Then, with an almost leisurely pace, he reached for his napkin, unfolded it, and set it down beside his plate. And finally, he looked Nathan directly in the eye. His gaze was steady, unblinking. And when he spoke, his voice was so calm, so impossibly controlled, that it made the air grow heavier. "Are you sure you want to do this?" It wasn't a question. It was a warning. Nathan froze, just for a second. But Shaq saw it. Everyone saw it. The flicker of hesitation, the briefest moment where doubt cracked through Nathan's carefully constructed mask. But then, like a man too deep into his own mess to back out now, Nathan recovered quickly. His jaw tightened, his stance stiffened. He let out a breath, forced out a laugh, but this one was different. Not confidence. Something else. He squared his shoulders, desperate to reclaim his previous position of control. "It's just a question," Nathan said, his voice carefully neutral, though the edge of arrogance still remained. "Didn't mean anything by it." Shaq didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, not enough to be aggressive, but just enough that Nathan felt the weight of the moment settle over him again. Shaq had spent years in rooms like this. Years being tested, being underestimated, being dismissed. He knew exactly what was happening. And he knew exactly what came next. The restaurant was holding its breath now. The ones who had laughed earlier? They weren't laughing anymore. The ones who had looked away, pretending not to notice? Now they couldn't stop watching. Shaq allowed the silence to stretch for just a few seconds longer. Just enough for Nathan to start shifting on his feet. Just enough to make him wonder if he had finally pushed too far. Then at last, Shaq leaned back and smiled. Not a grin, not amusement, just a slow, measured expression that made Nathan's fingers twitch at his side. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to argue. Because the moment had already flipped. Nathan just hadn't realized it yet. At the bar, a waiter discreetly grabbed a fresh bottle of the Margot 2015. He had seen enough. And though Nathan might have thought he ran this restaurant, he didn't own it. That power? That power belonged to the man sitting at table 7. And soon, everyone would know exactly who he was. The restaurant was silent. Not the kind of silence that came with elegance and sophistication, the kind that the Windsor Royale prided itself on. No, this was different. This was a silence that carried weight, tension, the unbearable pressure of a moment shifting before everyone's eyes. Nathan Caldwell still stood by the table, his stance stiff, his smirk faltering just slightly. He had played this game before, humiliating customers who didn't belong, making them second-guess their worth. But for the first time, something about this moment felt wrong. Shaq hadn't snapped. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene, hadn't taken the bait. Instead, he studied Nathan with unnerving calmness, as if he already knew the outcome of this battle before it had even begun. Then, with an ease that felt deliberate, Shaq reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. His movements were unhurried, precise. And then, he placed something on the table. A small, sleek business card, black with gold lettering. Nathan barely glanced at it before snatching it up. His fingers curled around the edges, his smirk already returning, his arrogance still intact, until his eyes landed on the name printed across the card. And then, he stopped breathing. His face, so smug just seconds ago, turned ghostly white. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. His fingers twitched, gripping the card like he wasn't sure if he wanted to drop it or hide it. Because staring back at him in bold, elegant letters were words he never expected to see. James Big Shaq, Reynolds owner and CEO, Reynolds Dining Group. Nathan's throat went dry. The room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in. This wasn't just some guy who had wandered in. This wasn't just a rich businessman. Shaq owned the entire restaurant chain, not just this Windsor Royale, all of them. A sharp inhale came from somewhere in the room. A whisper. Someone at a nearby table tapped furiously on their phone, Googling the name that had just shattered Nathan's world. And one by one, recognition spread. A woman at the bar muttered, "Wait, I've heard that name before." A suited man at a table near the entrance slowly leaned back, his brows rising. "That's him?" Shaq remained still, watching Nathan with a level of patience that now felt almost cruel. Nathan's fingers clenched the card, his pulse hammering in his ears. His carefully crafted persona, the confidence, the control, it was all slipping through his grasp. The entire restaurant had turned against him, and he could feel it. And then, Shaq leaned in slightly. Not enough to be aggressive, just enough to make Nathan feel the full weight of what had just happened. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, steady, but it carried the kind of power that didn't need volume. "Now," Shaq said smoothly, his eyes never leaving Nathan's. "Let's try this again." Nathan felt something he had never felt before. Fear. Not the fear of physical harm. Shaq had never even raised his voice. This was a different kind of fear. The fear of irrelevance, of consequence, of realizing he had pushed the wrong man at the wrong time. Nathan swallowed hard, but it didn't help. His throat was tight. His suit suddenly felt too warm. He forced his mouth open, searching for words. An apology? An excuse? A desperate attempt at recovery? But Shaq wasn't done yet. He sat back in his chair, exhaling slowly, taking his time. He adjusted his cuff, let the moment breathe, let Nathan squirm. Then, with the same calm authority, he gestured toward the menu. "I believe I ordered the Margot 2015, Shaq said, his tone deadly smooth. Nathan hesitated too long. It was a second, maybe less. But everyone in the restaurant saw it. Everyone knew what it meant. He was defeated. And worse, he knew it. At the bar, the bartender gave a quick nod to one of the other waiters. Within seconds, a bottle of the Margot 2015 was uncorked and being brought to Shaq's table. Nathan was no longer in control. He wasn't the one deciding how things would go. And the realization crushed him. He cleared his throat, forcing out a weak, "Of course, sir." But the damage was done. He turned sharply, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing. How had this happened? How had he gone from owning the moment to being completely, utterly powerless? It was humiliating. It was public. And worst of all, it was his own fault. At a table across the restaurant, the woman in the navy blue dress watched with mild amusement, swirling the wine in her glass. She had seen many men like Nathan before. Men who thought power was about control, about exclusion. Men who thought they could decide who belonged and who didn't. But what Nathan failed to realize, what men like him always failed to realize, was that true power wasn't in keeping people out. It was in knowing that no one could ever keep you out in the first place. And Big Shaq? He had known that from the second he walked in. The moment had shifted. Not gradually, not subtly. It had flipped completely, like a table overturned in the middle of a feast. Nathan Caldwell, who had spent the entire evening controlling the pace, deciding the rules, manipulating the balance of power, now stood frozen. His face was still pale, his grip still tight around Shaq's business card, as if clutching it would somehow reverse what had just happened. But it wouldn't. Because now, the entire restaurant knew exactly who Shaq was, and more importantly, they knew exactly what Nathan had just done. The other waiters, The ones who had followed Nathan's lead, who had exchanged quiet smirks, who had looked the other way when the service was deliberately slow, who had subtly mirrored his tone of condescension, were now staring at the floor. One of them, a younger man no older than 25, stood by the bar, his hands clenched together, jaw tight with regret. He had wanted to say something earlier. He had hesitated, let the moment slip. Now he was ashamed. Another, a blonde waitress who had smirked when Shaq's water was forgotten, took a slow step backward, her gaze flicking toward the exit as if contemplating disappearing altogether. And the guests? The guests had become a silent jury. Some sat stiffly, pretending to focus on their meals, desperate to detach themselves from the scene unfolding before them. Others were hooked, watching closely, invested in how this played out. And then, there were the few who weren't hiding their reactions at all. At a table near the far side of the room, a man in his 60s, a silver-haired CEO type, dressed in a pristine tuxedo, shook his head slowly before setting his fork down. At another table, a woman in a sleek black dress whispered something to her date, then took out her phone, typing quickly. It was happening. The moment was escaping the room. The restaurant manager burst onto the scene with the urgency of a man who already knew he was walking into disaster. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s, his suit slightly wrinkled from hours of handling VIP requests, his tie loosened just enough to suggest a long night. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He could feel it. The unnatural stillness. The tension thick enough to choke on. The way Nathan stood there, exposed, looking like a man who had just realized he was standing on thin ice, and that ice had already cracked beneath his feet. The manager's eyes flicked to Shaq, and recognition flashed instantly. Oh no. He cleared his throat, stepping forward. Mr. Reynolds, But before he could finish, someone else spoke. Well, a voice drawled from across the room, carrying just enough amusement to slice through the tension like a well-sharpened blade. This just got interesting. All heads turned. The woman in the navy blue dress had finally spoken. She had been silent all evening, watching, absorbing, calculating. But now she leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, fingers interlocked, her dark red lips curving into something between intrigue and expectation. She wasn't just another guest. She was a journalist. And she wasn't here for the meal anymore. She was here for the story. Nathan's breath hitched. The moment had gone from a quiet power shift to something much, much worse. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This was a spectacle. This was the kind of thing that didn't stay contained. This was the kind of thing that made headlines, that went viral, that left permanent stains on reputations. He needed to recover. Fast. Nathan cleared his throat, finally finding his voice. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. He tried, but his words stumbled over themselves, awkward, forced. I wasn't aware of Mr. Reynolds' status. Shaq remained silent, watching. Nathan swallowed, his fingers twitching. Of course, if I had known. Shaq's gaze sharpened, and Nathan stopped talking. Because he knew. He knew there was no recovering from that sentence. Because what he had just admitted was worse than anything else he had done all night. He hadn't denied Shaq respect because of some unfortunate oversight. He had denied him respect because he assumed he wasn't worth it. And now? Now there was no way out of it. Shaq let the silence sit. Let Nathan sweat. Because he had learned a long time ago, some men don't learn through words. They learn through moments. Through the feeling of the ground shifting beneath them. Through consequences. And Nathan was feeling them now. Hard. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Shaq spoke. His voice was steady, unhurried. But it carried the weight of every insult, every humiliation, every moment of disrespect that had led to this point. I wasn't aware, he said slowly, that a guest's status determined the level of respect they received here. Nathan visibly swallowed. That's not. Shaq lifted a hand, cutting him off. Nathan fell silent. The journalist in navy blue tilted her head slightly, intrigued. Shaq exhaled through his nose, then leaned forward. Just slightly. Just enough. Tell me something, Nathan, he said, his voice quieter now, more dangerous because of it. Nathan didn't move. Shaq tapped a single finger against the table. You had no idea who I was. A pause. But you thought you did. Nathan's jaw clenched. Shaq let the words sink in before continuing, his tone never rising, never needing to. Tell me, he said. What exactly did you see when I walked in? Nathan's breath hitched again, because there was no right answer to that question. And Shaq knew it. The journalist's smile widened just a fraction. This was gold. The restaurant manager finally stepped in, desperate to salvage the moment. Mr. Reynolds, I sincerely apologize for… Shaq's eyes cut to him. The manager froze mid-sentence. Shaq let another moment of silence stretch. Then at last, he leaned back, his expression shifting. Not to amusement, not to forgiveness, but to something closer to quiet understanding. Because he had seen this exact scenario before. He had lived it, and he knew exactly how it would end. At the bar, another waiter whispered something to the bartender. At a nearby table, a man refreshed his phone screen, watching for a breaking story that hadn't even hit the internet yet. But soon would. And at the entrance, a well-dressed couple who had arrived moments ago took one look at the scene unfolding before them, and turned back toward the door. Because they knew. Everyone in the room knew. The Windsor Royale was never going to be the same after tonight. And neither was Nathan Caldwell. The moment had reached its peak. Nathan Caldwell, once the self-assured gatekeeper of the Windsor Royale, now stood in the middle of the restaurant, his entire world falling apart around him. His hands twitched at his sides, his breath shallow, his face pale. He had spent years controlling moments like this, deciding who was worth respect, who deserved to be dismissed, who would walk away feeling small. Now, he was the one shrinking. And Shaq was still sitting calmly, effortlessly, watching him. The balance of power had flipped. Nathan could feel it weighing down on him, pressing against his chest like an invisible force. And then, the manager spoke. Nathan. The word came out sharp, clipped, carrying the full weight of authority. The restaurant manager, already flushed with panic, turned to him, his voice low but final. You're done. A hush fell over the room. Nathan's stomach dropped. He had known this was coming, had felt the ground beneath him cracking ever since Shaq placed that business card on the table. But hearing it spoken aloud in front of everyone, made it real. Sir, Nathan started, but the manager cut him off with a single look. There's no way to fix this, the manager said, voice tight, clipped with frustration. You've embarrassed this restaurant, humiliated a VIP guest, and made us a liability. Pack your things, you're fired. Nathan opened his mouth, to protest, to beg, to grasp for any last shred of dignity. But before he could say a word, Shaq spoke. Wait. One word. Calm. Controlled. But it stopped everything. The manager turned toward Shaq, confused. Everyone did. Nathan, still breathing heavily, snapped his head up, hope flickering in his eyes. Shaq leaned back in his chair, watching, studying, deciding. Finally, after a pause, he spoke. You fire him now, Shaq said, voice smooth. And what happens? The manager hesitated. Shaq already knew the answer. Nathan walks out of here, Shaq continued. Pretends none of this happened, and by tomorrow, he's working somewhere else. Same position, same attitude, same sense of power. Nathan flinched. Shaq exhaled, tapping his fingers lightly against the table. That's not real accountability. The words cut through the air like a blade. A few guests murmured. Some nodded. The journalist in the navy blue dress raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. The manager frowned. Mr. Reynolds, with all due respect, what else would you suggest? Shaq's gaze drifted back to Nathan, who was still standing there, fists clenched, humiliated but silent. And then, Shaq made his decision. You stay, Shaq said simply. Nathan blinked, stunned. What? Shaq's expression remained unreadable. You stay, but not as head waiter. Nathan's confusion deepened, as did everyone else's. Shaq tilted his head slightly, letting the moment breathe. You're going to work under the very people you ignored, the ones you disrespected, the black and brown staff you thought weren't worth your time. Silence. Heavy. Thick. A young black waiter near the bar straightened slightly, his eyes widening. The bartender froze mid-pour. Nathan's jaw tensed. His pride fought against the words before they even fully sank in. Shaq didn't let up. "You'll do the jobs you thought were beneath you," Shaq continued, his voice low but unwavering. "You'll clear tables. You'll serve guests without judgment. You'll listen." Nathan took a slow step back, shaking his head. "No," he muttered, voice raw. "No way." Shaq just watched him. "You have two choices," Shaq said. "You can take your chances out there. Jobless, with a ruined reputation, knowing every major restaurant in this city will hear about what happened tonight." Nathan's breathing hitched. "Or," Shaq continued, "you stay. You face the people you belittled, and you learn." Nathan didn't move. The entire restaurant felt like it was holding its breath, waiting. The manager opened his mouth, to protest, to question, but he stopped. Because Shaq wasn't giving a suggestion. He was giving an order, and everyone knew it. Nathan's face was a war zone of emotions. Anger, shame, panic. He wanted to leave. Every fiber in his body told him to run, to walk out and pretend none of this happened. But if he did, what then? His career? Destroyed. His reputation? Gone. The thought of job hunting with this scandal attached to his name, the thought of being known as the man who humiliated himself in front of a billionaire CEO, it was too much. Nathan's hands curled into fists, his stomach twisted. He had never been given an ultimatum before. He had always been the one in control. And now, he was powerless. The manager cleared his throat. "Well?" Nathan's jaw clenched. He looked at Shaq, hating him, fearing him, resenting him. But most of all, knowing he had lost. Nathan forced himself to breathe, swallowed the last shreds of his pride, and then, finally, he nodded. A stiff, reluctant movement, but a nod nonetheless. A few waiters exchanged glances. Some looked surprised, others looked satisfied. Because in the end, this wasn't just about Nathan. This was about everyone in the room who had ever been dismissed, the ones who had been overlooked, the ones who had been assumed to be less than. And now the rules had changed. Because Shaq had changed them. The restaurant didn't go back to normal that night. It never would. The weight of what had happened lingered, stretched, embedded itself into the walls of the Windsor Royale. Nathan had once believed that power belonged to those who decided who was worthy of a seat at the table. But Shaq had just proven that real power belonged to those who owned the table itself. And that was a lesson no one in the room would ever forget. The restaurant still hummed with tension, even though the moment had technically passed. Shaq had made his decision. Nathan had made his choice. And yet, it didn't feel over. The weight of what had happened still hung in the air, thick and unmoving. Conversations had restarted, but they were quieter now, more hesitant, as if everyone in the room knew they had just witnessed something they weren't supposed to forget. Some guests stole glances at Shaq as he stood from his table, sliding his phone into his pocket. Others watched Nathan, who now stood deflated, exposed, with nothing left to say. It should have ended there. But then, a voice cut through the quiet. "You realize this won't just fade away, right?" Shaq paused. He turned. The woman in the navy blue dress was standing now, her sharp gaze locked onto him, intrigue flickering behind her eyes. She hadn't just been watching. She had been taking notes. She stepped forward, the faintest smirk on her lips, not out of amusement, but as if she had just found the headline of her next story. "You embarrassed someone with connections," she continued, her voice measured but pointed. "Someone who isn't going to forget this." Shaq exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. He knew what she meant, because this wasn't his first time. He had seen it before. He had lived it before. And he knew exactly what was coming. Nathan wasn't just some headwaiter with a bad attitude. Nathan was a symptom of a much bigger disease, the quiet, unspoken hierarchy that decided who was worth respect and who wasn't. The industry was built on it, A system where people like Nathan were rewarded for keeping certain doors closed. And now Shaq had kicked one of those doors open, which meant someone, somewhere, was going to try to shut it again. The journalist tilted her head slightly, studying his face. "So," she asked, "what happens next?" Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze drifting back toward the Windsor Royale, taking in the waitstaff who had once followed Nathan's lead, but now looked shaken, uncertain. The guests who had once been complicit in silence but now sat thoughtful, unsettled. Even Nathan, who still stood frozen, realizing his entire world had just shifted under his feet. This wasn't just about one night. This wasn't just about one restaurant. This was about something bigger. And Shaq knew it. He turned back to the journalist, his expression unreadable. Then, with one final glance at the room, at the people still watching him, still waiting for what came next, Shaq walked out. A moment of power. A shift in control. One truth that changed everything. But this isn't just a story. It's a reality many still face. Would you have spoken up? Would you have stayed silent? Or would you have been the one who got exposed? Share your thoughts. Because in the real world, power isn't just taken, it's challenged.